Hi, everyone. This is Lydia, sign name L. Brown. Welcome. We're running a bit late due to technical difficulties and bats in my house. Not a typo or an exaggeration. This is not my house. We will be getting started in just a few minutes, but while we are waiting to resolve those technical difficulties and get our other guest online as one of those difficulties, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share where you are joining us from and what brings you here today. You should also be able to access the captioning by clicking the View CC button below. And we also have a stream text link available, which I will provide in just a moment in the chat that you can access as well.
Hi, Lydia, this is Cindy. I don't think the stream text was set up, so let me see if I can create the event for you and if I can set it up. Sorry, I think they thought this was only going to be through Zoom, so.
This is Lydia. Kyle did send me a stream text link for today, so there might have just been a miscommunication. Generally, we've been trying both to integrate our captions into the Zoom and to offer the stream text link so that both folks who can't join by Zoom and folks who find it easier to see the stream text are able to access it. Let me know if you're able to reconfigure, and I can then share an updated link in our chat as well.
Okay, so sorry about the miscommunication. Let me try to set it up on my end. If not, I have to try to contact the coordinator and see if they can set it up. But just give me 1 minute and I will try that right now. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I set one up. Can you just double check to see if it's working on your end?
This is Lydia. Is it at the same link that I already shared, or is there a different URL?
It's the same link. It should be the same link.
Let me double check. This is Lydia, testing that captioning is working. It is working, great. So I will let folks know that you can access our captioning again, both through the caption stream link as well as by clicking View CC or CC View Subtitles. And again, we'll just be starting in a couple of minutes. We're still waiting on our other guests to get on. Hi, Jilisa. This is Lydia.
Hi, this is Jilisa.
Great. Now that you're here and Mahlet says that she is also ready to share the panel portion of our webinar, we can get started. And just to give everyone a moment, I'm going to begin streaming us to Facebook. For those who are just joining, welcome. You're right on time because we've had to start a little bit late due to a lot of technical difficulties and bats in my house forcing me to flee outside of my home. This is not where I live. So yeah, really fun trying to be like, oh great, I'm hosting a webinar for work and I don't live here. If you haven't yet, please feel free to share where you are Zooming from in the chat and what brings you to today's conversation. I am joining you from occupied, unceded Piscataway land, the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. And many of you have shared where you are from as well. Let me get that stream to Facebook set up. And again, we have access to captioning available via Zoom as well as on stream text. Please feel free to join our conversation on Twitter at #liberatingwebinars. And Mahlet, thumbs up, are you ready? As soon as I can get us on Facebook, right?
Are upset, rightfully so.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network's next program in the Liberating Webinar series. I am excited today to be presenting to you Disrupting Educational Ableism and Racism, Disability, Race, and Trauma in Schools. My name is Lydia XZ Brown. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a gray shawl in a room with 2 windows with blinds behind me. I am AWN's Director of Policy, Advocacy, and External Affairs. And this afternoon, I am excited to introduce to you 2 guests who are both friends and comrades of mine. First, I'd like to introduce Mahlet Meshesha, LCSW, a school-based trauma therapist where she works with youth and families of color. Her clinical practice is focused on decolonizing mental health treatment and addressing how oppressive structural and cultural factors impact mental health and wellness. She received her Master's of Social Work in 2019 from Boston University, where she specialized in child trauma and social work leadership. Currently, she's obtaining her Master's in Public Health at George Washington University. Second, I'd like to introduce Jilisa Milton, an Alabama-based civil rights attorney, policy analyst, social worker, racial justice activist, community organizer, and relational strategist. She has nearly a decade of experience working at the intersection of racial equity, critical race and feminist theory, poverty, criminal justice reform, mental health, and reproductive justice. Ms. Milton currently practices law in Alabama, implementing a project in the Black Belt that protects children with disabilities from entering the school-to-prison pipeline and ensures access to disability-related legal services and health services. During our program tonight, you can access subtitles by clicking the button that says CC, and you may choose the option to view subtitle or show full transcript. You can also click the link that we have pasted in the chat to access the captions on a separate page. Throughout our time together, you will be able to see our ASL interpreter on screen. If you are having difficulty, please feel free to send a message to the chat. And with that, I would like to welcome Mahlet and Jilisa to please turn your videos on. I am so glad that you are joining us today. I want to start our conversation by asking each of you to talk a little bit more about how trauma shows up in the work you currently do, especially as related to racism and ableism. Jilisa, would you like to address that first?
Sure. So I do a lot of different work. And I want to be clear, you were talking about my trauma and also the trauma of like how I see my clients and stuff like that. Is that what you mean?
This is Lydia. I mean trauma in any of these ways, how trauma shows up at the systemic or structural level, how trauma shows up at the interpersonal level, how trauma shows up in school settings or in other places and spaces where you are currently organizing or you are working as a social worker or a lawyer, in any of those ways.
Okay, so this is Jilisa. I believe that just being a Black female attorney who has an anxiety disorder and who's in a space that is very hyper-focused, hyper-efficiency based, and just kind of being in a space where my labor is kind of always being, the primary conversation. I think that just my trauma presents just in itself with the interactions that I have at work. I'm the only Black attorney at my job. And, it's very difficult to bring those conversations up. I'm a survivor of police violence. And right now we're in the middle of the last 2 years of just experiencing a whole lot of conversations about how that affects Black people, how that creates an emotional tax, how that creates situations where you might wake up one day and you might not really want to, you might not feel like you want to engage in certain conversations at work. And just kind of dealing with that in the middle of a pandemic definitely really honed in that those triggers for me. So just dealing with that has been very difficult. I've seen that, kind of present itself with my clients too, and how especially the kids I work with who have ADHD or anxiety issues or mental health disorders, and how that in itself has created a really difficult dynamic as we see how the pandemic affects the school system, affects parents. So I think, especially right now, trauma is such a thing that is constantly happening, but in a lot of ways ignored as we try to push through. But, you know, it's been something that's been on my mind lately, just as I experienced how heightened that has been, and just like how it can even be perpetuated by some of the people who just want to like get through the pandemic. So yeah, I've seen, especially in the last year, it's just been very hard to watch. Yeah.
This is Lydia. The last year, you know, has been a time of collective crisis and trauma for everybody, but that trauma falls unequally and unjustly on all of us who come from marginalized and especially multiply marginalized communities. So thank you for calling attention to that and naming that. Mahlet, what would you say about how trauma shows up in the work you do?
This is Mahlet, and it comes up in every way possible. And I think it really comes down to all these isms: classism, ableism, racism, and we live in this toxic soup where it's hard to escape that unless there are people actively pushing back and building community. I think for the students that I work with, it comes up as anxiety, it comes up with PTSD, flashbacks, it's not having food on the table, it's having to work because their parents are undocumented and got laid off, they don't qualify for stimulus checks, like all of these different factors that puts people in like hypervigilant mode and going into survival mode to do whatever they can to survive. I don't know if you can hear the motorcycle outside my window, but whoever's editing, edit that out.
Lydia,
and then in regards, sorry?
We don't hear it, so you're good to go.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. And then specifically in regards to the pandemic, that has been really hard for a lot of my students who have learning disabilities, who have IEPs, and their IEPs have not changed whatsoever to accommodate school online. And luckily the school I have worked at, teachers have been really flexible and mean with their students in every way possible. Some are doing even home visits, bringing printed out packets of assignments. However, there's only so much we can do where the system just really takes a toll. And it's all these individual actions that are happening that are good, but people are getting burnt out. And students are struggling and they want to come back and they're super excited to come back, and yet we're balancing like, how safe is it to come back? What will that look like? How do we ensure the students who are immunocompromised are staying safe? The students who have asthma, where Boston has a huge rate of asthma among Black and Brown youth, having other chronic health conditions, to make sure that they are getting access to their education in a way that fits them well, but doesn't jeopardize their health.
This is Lydia. I often talk about the ways in which racism and ableism operate by deliberately obscuring and making invisible the ways that disability shows up in minoritized and marginalized communities, especially disability that is literally caused by environmental racism and racialized capitalism and settler colonialism and imperialism. And when you were just saying, right, that asthma is more common in Black and Brown children, it's literally a product of environmental racism. And yet our school systems are designed to deliberately deprive and deny access to resources for disabled Black and Brown children in particular, and disabled children of color from any community of color more generally. So I would love it if both of you would be able to outline a little bit for the folks that are on here who might know, yes, there's racism, yes, there's ableism and the way that our educational system works, but don't necessarily know what that looks like concretely. Like they know that it's there, but they wouldn't be able to explain it. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually looks like? And either one of you can feel free to start us off.
This is Jilisa. one of the things that I like to talk about when I think about the school system and maybe like those discrepancies is like this idea of cultural dominance and how like in these spaces, there's one way to really succeed, and that way looks like a white capitalist, testing metrics-based way. How do you behave? How do you sit? How do you speak? And I work for a protection and advocacy agency, and like how having to come in and say like, this should be individualized in a way that actually helps a child kind of like, get what they need and learn how they learn, and just seeing the pushback because of how the school system really does prefers often this uniformity. And that's just not how people work. Thinking about how integration and how even like how the discrepancies happen with that. I saw a recent short doc clip about Black deaf people and how they were integrated into white schools and their language was different, and how that kind of translated into like how they were able to really like communicate and really get access to education because their cultural differences. And in school systems also just like ideas about criminality of kids and how that racism kind of interferes. I work a lot with the school to prison pipeline and juvenile court and how kids can get pushed through because their behaviors aren't necessarily matching what they think they're supposed to be doing, or when they react and how they feel about things. And you can kind of intersect that with the idea of SROs, school resource officers, and their presence in schools, and how kids with disabilities, especially Black children with disabilities, it aren't really given space to experience triggers and like deal with them and get that kind of insight and work through those things because of that, how people label them. And I think that that's like the disheartening. It's like, when you don't fit the way that people think you're supposed to, you're automatically discarded, you're automatically like disposable. And that translates even further when we become adults and like, how the world doesn't really embrace those differences, and even like how, that can have even more catastrophic, effects in your life. So the school system to me sometimes is like the beginning for all this trauma to start happening. And I think that's why the school to prison pipeline is such an important thing to disrupt, both for Black people and for, people who are experiencing, disabilities. And, even when the intersection of parenting and how like parents are expected to kind of carry the world. And right now, one of the things I'm really frustrated about is this, how school systems are using truancy as a way to address concerns with children with disabilities. And maybe they aren't, maybe a child has ADHD and they're not, the class is overwhelming. They're not participating. They don't have any, supports, as we said earlier, and like how, maybe that parent is disabled, maybe that parent has a lot of things on their back. Maybe they're experiencing trauma, and like, it all kinds of kind of connects. And it's just, in school we're told that it's a nurturing place. It's a place where people can, learn their social skills. They can, be like developed and all these things, but it really is like a convenience-based model that sometimes frustrates me.
This is Lydia. My partner, Shane, and I often talk about education as inherently institutional. And while not, most schools are not total institutions in the same way as a large-scale developmental disabilities institution, a psych hospital, or a prison, that schools are nonetheless institutional and carceral sites where students, especially those who are multiply marginalized, queer and trans, Black, brown, and Native, disabled, and especially those who experience multiple forms of those types of oppression, right, are literally subjected to social control mechanisms that are meant to contain and manage people whose existence is inconvenient or uncomfortable for those who are resourced, privileged, and of dominant cultures. So I really appreciate you naming that reality and talking about that Mahlet, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think some concrete things where that school to prison pipeline really comes up is in every school that I've worked in Boston, the first thing a student sees is the metal detector and a security officer. And they go through every morning like it's routine. Occasionally there are bag searches. And it's really interesting to see how students and staff are just like, yep, it's Monday morning, I'm getting my bag searched. And after this, I'm going to homeroom and, you know, first period. Also that parents get filed on when their students don't come to school on time or missing multiple days, no matter what that reason is, and how parents have to call the school and provide all this type of documentation to show that, you know, they're not just, I don't know, running around at their house doing nothing. And if there's a certain number of school days missed, it can lead to going to court, it can lead to getting a parole officer. And I mean, I haven't been in the field for very long, but I have never seen that be helpful at all. I don't know how a parole officer is supposed to help you get to school when you have to drop off your siblings. You're the one who's waking everyone up. You're the one who has to get them breakfast. You're dropping them off and then go to, you know, your own school. Or you wake up and have an anxiety attack and feel like, oh my gosh, something bad's going to happen today. I can't go to school. Or I wasn't able to get laundry done and there's nothing for me to wear to get to school. Or even the bus was late. You know, the orange line decided to like spontaneously combust. And those external factors aren't looked at. And so I think it really makes it like, it really makes it seem like the students aren't trying, or they're literally criminalized for things that they're outside of their control and being blamed for things that are outside of their control. And they know that. They're very much aware of how these systems work. And I think the highlight for me in doing therapy with them is naming those things and giving them the vocabulary to be like, no, that's white supremacy, period. And at times they'll be able to describe what those things are, but not have the vocabulary to say what they are, and finally feeling validated and knowing that there's something, there's a name for it, and that they're not the only ones who experience this, and it's something larger. Another example is testing that is racist and ableist and capitalistic. And in Boston, they're still doing MCAS this year, and a lot of my students are upset, rightfully so. I don't know even how they're going to administer that. That sounds like a logistical nightmare that I would assume that everyone would want to avoid. Apparently not. And students know that they're like, I don't know anything. I don't think I'm going to pass. I also feel like they know that this is related to schools and school funding. It's not really about their learning. And with a couple of students, we've talked about like pushing back. What does pushing back look like? What does taking agency look like? I will not be held responsible for whatever happens. But I was like, TikTok and Twitter and Instagram reels, like you can start a movement. And you know, they're already cutting the SATs and the ACTs for colleges. So what else? And in regards to testing, is like sitting still, paying attention for long periods of time, staring at the computer. And if a child's not able to do that, calling security, and you know, making them sit out in the hallway, being isolated, all sorts of things that escalate to a point where it's harmful for the student, for others, that particular student, classmates who are watching, who are learning that, oh, that's what I should not do. I should be afraid of doing anything like that, or that student's bad. And they should be treated differently because I'm good and I sit still or whatever. All perpetuate all these larger isms, particularly racism and ableism.
This is Lydia. The process of criminalization is in itself profoundly and inescapably racist and ableist. And all the things that both of you have been talking about, right? Like, I'm just thinking about when I was in school and when during a brief period where I was representing clients as a lawyer, most of my clients were disabled Black and brown kids. And just about the levels and the compounded levels of racist, ableist fuckery that kids have to deal with because of the ways in which criminalization operates in schools themselves. And I don't think that enough people are talking about schools as not just a point on a linear pipeline of school to prison pipeline, but as schools as part of a whole interlocking web and system of carcerality that isn't necessarily linear, because so many of the systems that allegedly exist to support or to be positive forces in people's lives, like education is supposed to be a good thing, but that system is carceral. And it's a site of carcerality. It's a place where people go to be institutionalized, to be controlled, especially for disabled, multiply marginalized kids, to be told you need to be fixed. And if you can't be fixed, then you need to be managed for other people to feel comfortable around you. Systems that are supposed to be about protecting people, the child protective services system, which is really just the family regulation system, like calling it what it is, that it is, this foster system is not about care. It is a system that is part of that whole broader systems of family regulation that have always served to disrupt and to destroy Black, brown, Native, and Asian people's families in particular. All of those systems exist within that same interconnected web. They don't exist outside of it. So that brings me to the next question that I want to ask. And that question is, how can neurodivergent and other disabled people, especially those of us who are at the margins of the margins, make critical interventions and inroads into educational advocacy and other spaces that are deeply carceral? And Mahlet, you maybe could start us off talking about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can start with this one. So when I work with my students, I like to incorporate activism work into the therapy that we're doing, because that's healing in itself, and helping them, again, naming what is going on and having a conversation of what would the ideal look like. And if you had a magical wand and you could change everything, what would that world be? And then talking about like, what steps would it need to happen in order to get to that place? And I like to use the liberation health model to help kind of look at what particular thing they're struggling with and see what other factors are contributing to it. So part of the triangle is, what are some personal factors? What are some of the cultural factors? So like isms, racism, ableism, et cetera, and then institutional factors. So like capitalism, schools, hospitals, et cetera. And allow them to think of an action plan, a way to push back. And it can be something as simple as, I have a student I'm working with who has an eating disorder, and talked about how different systems perpetuate this notion that she has to be skinny. And if she's not skinny, she won't be successful, she'll never be loved, she'll never get anywhere in life. And then layering on top of being a woman of color. And one of the interventions or ways of pushing back was wearing a crop top, going outside and wearing a crop top and being like, you know what, I'm gonna wear this and I'm going to own this. And so in regards to, and how that's tied to her own trauma, and pushing back and saying, no, I have agency. I'm no longer going to be the object in the situation, but I'm going to be the subject. Little note to Paulo Freire there. And in regards to other interventions, it's more grassroots things. So ways where students can collaborate with each other. Because I think oftentimes people who are the most marginalized, we forget that how much power that we have. And it's because we're reminded constantly that we don't have power. And particularly youth who get ignored and pushed aside in a lot of decision making, we're reminding them that there's more of them than us, really. If they wanted to take over the school, they were really good if they wanted to. And some of that was, pushing back on testing, asking, group accommodations for the entire class, changing school policies, like how you do your hair. You should be able to do your own hair however you want and not be penalized at school, or, wearing a hoodie, or, etc. So that's where my work comes in. It's not necessarily been at like the policy level. It's more of teaching students and facilitating and providing students the tools to organize amongst themselves.
Jilisa, would you like to add to that as well, how you can see and have already experienced disabled and neurodivergent people actually intervening in educational advocacy, bringing our perspectives, bringing a disability justice perspective to that space?
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do personally is very like legal oriented, which people think is very like freeing, but it's actually really limiting. It's like one, through the ADA and through the IDEA, how those laws allow you to have these civil rights lens and kind of step in. In my experience, that only got me through the door. It got me through the door to say like, this is what's happening. But when I got there, I realized somebody's, ignoring the parent, somebody's ignoring the child, somebody's not listening. Now we have to talk about psychoeducation because they don't even understand the disability the child has. And there's all these other things related to like we were just talking about with race and gender and all these other things might come into play because, I think that self-advocacy and even like these concepts of abolition, having those conversations with yourself so that you don't get gaslit, is the best way. Because especially with self-advocacy, like saying, this is how I learn. I know what you're saying, but this is how I learn. And pushing through that conversation that people think they know better. Like I believe that, people with disabilities, especially children, should talk to their parents and the schools about like, this is what's what's going on. And people usually ignore children and paternalize them. And that's probably even more of a thing if a child has a disability. And I feel like I've always encouraged that self-advocacy, whether it's the parents kind of advocating for their child or the child's feeling coming into the conversation. And so like, it's kind of like, the typical thing of like nothing, about us without us kind of conversation, because it's really important. And, I think like systemically, like, I'm a Black attorney and sometimes parents feel, especially like Black and people, parents of color, they feel a lot comfortable being like, I think this school is racist. I think these people, than they would my colleagues. And I consider that a good thing that I can be a part of and say like, yeah, I think like, I appreciate your perspective on that and encouraging that so they don't feel gaslit as well, that, oh, that person's behavior is just because they just are busy or they're tired or they're stressed out. If that parent feels those things are happening and may not have the words to describe it, helping them gain that lens or helping that child gain that lens is helpful. Because honestly, it's no wonder why kids get in school and they get in arguments with teachers that they know are racist, and how do you have that conversation in the middle of an IEP meeting or trying to get a functional behavior assessment when, the whole problem is that they're, the child senses something that they're not able to describe. So like, I think knowing not just what to do, what to get out of your way, and so I think half the battle, in my experience, has been, not half the battle, a small part of the battle has been, hey, I have this legal information. And the rest of it has included so much more, just in terms of advocacy. And that's why I appreciate the systemic conversations about school systems, because parents often and kids often feel like they're being difficult. They're the problem because of what they're told about schools. And, when they understand those systemic conversations, they can say, oh, I wasn't, irrational. I wasn't being difficult. This is something that happens to a lot of people. And those moments are the times that I've seen the most happen, is when those things come together for somebody.
I completely agree with you. Sorry, Lydia, this is Mahlet. I completely agree. And, as a Black woman myself, having students come up to me and sharing things that they wouldn't necessarily share with other teachers, clinicians, and how their progress in therapy is completely changed while working together, and just seeing that growth, because they can be their true selves and don't feel like there's going to be judgment. Like something as small as, showing up to therapy in their bonnet, and when they wouldn't otherwise go to therapy because there's this like feeling of shame and would have skipped completely. They know that I wouldn't care. We would talk about, what color their bonnet was and how they chose that color. And how that, that plays a significant role in building rapport and trust, and showing that, a lot of adults are shitty, a lot. However, there's some of us who will fight for them and do whatever possible for them to be happy and healthy, holistically.
This is Lydia. I certainly have always had that experience from my own positionality as an East Asian and openly disabled person of color, where people who wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable talking to a non-disabled person or a white person or a straight or cis person might feel more comfortable being more open with me because they know that I've experienced at least some of the same things that they have, and if not the exact same ones, then some similar ones. They know that I'm actually actively on their side rather than acting as another tool or person who is part of the same system. But for me, that's why it's so much more important for us as multiply marginalized people who do at least some of our work within and around those oppressive systems to support each other in carving out space for us in them. I don't see that as a path toward liberation. The law, like Jilisa said, is extremely limited as a tool. And frankly, it's literally a system and tool of oppression that was created to uphold genocide and chattel slavery and a lot of other fucked up things. So I don't think of the law as liberation. I don't think that having more disabled lawyers, or even specifically disabled lawyers of color, is going to be the solution to our problems. I don't think that having all special ed attorneys being disabled people of color from the queer and trans community will erase or disappear the problems endemic to the special education system in particular, or education as a whole. However, the more of us that are operating within or ancillary to those systems, the more collective power we have to disrupt them. So that brings me to my next question. I have two more. So my second to last question for you all is, how can we do anti-oppression, liberation-focused work within carceral spaces, like the family regulation system, which is a term that I thank Dorothy Roberts for, the legal system, the criminal or civil legal systems, the educational system, and the disability services system, all of which are often deeply carceral, deeply pathologizing places? how can we do anti-oppression, liberation-focused work in these spaces?
I can take this one. This is Mahlet. I've thought about this question for a very, very long time before going into social work school, during social work school, after graduating, and our field is awful, 100%. And the history of how our field even started was a bunch of white women who are like, look at all these poor people. Like, what if we just help them out because we're so bored? And social work has kind of moved a little way from there, not very much. And there's definitely like this leftist radical side of social work. However, that's not the majority of the field. And how I do anti-oppressive, liberation-focused therapy is meeting where my student is at, having them, have agency. I hate that I have to put down a diagnosis, but that's part of insurance and billing. And so like having a conversation together about what that diagnosis should be, if that feels appropriate. Asking them what they would like, the therapy to be like. I'll say, you're my boss. And they'll laugh. And I'm like, no, really, you could fire me if you wanted to. And reminding them that like, you have control in this situation, and acknowledging that power dynamic between the two of us, and saying like, I'm working for you and I want this to be helpful, and how do we make this helpful, and so that you feel cared for and feel well. On my side, it also looks like finding loopholes to things, and not necessarily saying certain things so that, things can fly under the radar. I'm trying to maintain my license, clearly. And being transparent where other people may not be. So let's say if there's a situation where I would have to file like a 51A, I always tell parents, like, if anything like that was going to happen, I'm going to call you first. You're going to know it was me. You're going to know why. We're going to talk about why this happened and how we can work through that in whatever way possible. Because and it really is about covering my own ass, which is awful. And my supervisor knows that. My supervisor knows that. And that's where the legal system comes into play. And so when that does happen, it's like, okay, now that this happened, let's figure out how to get out of this. And ideally, that wouldn't happen in the first place. But it's just one of those system things. And that's only if it's like very egregious. I've known people to file because they were doing a home visit and they were walking and their like foot fell through the floor, or because there was a hole in the floor. They filed because of like roaches, filed because a kid was eating leftover Popeyes for breakfast. And I was just like, how does that even make sense? How do you have the time in the day to do that? So really thinking critically, and it comes from my thinking critically about like what is going to do harm and what is absolutely necessary to do, and then having a plan when we're going to have to interact with the legal system, the educational system, and making that in the least oppressive way possible, if that makes sense.
You mentioned that sometimes you have to file a 51A. Can you explain what that is for folks who don't know?
Sure. So in Massachusetts, it's called a 51A. It's a form that anyone can fill out, stating if there's any suspected abuse of a child. And there's a separate one for older adults too, for elder abuse. And the keyword is suspected.
Right. And I remember from my time in Massachusetts that I had some incredibly demoralizing experiences with the Disabled Persons Protection Commission, an agency that specifically is charged with, at least in theory, investigating and dealing with reports of suspected abuse of disabled adults in whatever circumstance the abuse might have occurred. And I remember this very horrifying experience once of walking through their office and seeing on the wall sticky notes from a staff training that their staff had done, where almost everybody had written on a thing that they wanted to change or that they were frustrated with was saying, oh, we have too many cases, we want fewer cases. And at the same time, someone else had told me in a separate conversation that they believed that many investigators at the Disabled Persons Protection Commission were attempting to reduce the number of cases that they had to work on at all. And so I was horrified by this, not because just that it is also horrific and horrifying to know that, as we already do, that disabled people are particularly more likely to be abused, but that the number one thing that staff seem to want, based on the way those notes were written, was just, oh, we just don't want to be working as much. Which, if the reason for that is because we want there to be less abuse, great, but that the implications seem to be we don't really want to be working on these cases. That was really upsetting to me. Jilisa, would you be open to sharing a bit about this as well, how you see yourself or others as being able to do anti-oppression, liberation-focused work in carceral and oppressive systems?
Yeah, it's a lot. I am like doubly affected in this way, and I don't say affected because I chose to do it, but like being like a social worker, a licensed social worker, and a licensed attorney is like just a a lot. And that, and I think about a lot of times like how I am the law, like in general, like how, you literally have to become a part of these things in order to work within them. And myself from, kind of like assimilating into the ideals and like, the perspectives that those systems have about people and about like, who's smarter and who should be making decisions. And, and I feel that it's not easy. I have to take a step back sometimes. In some ways it helps me because I'm like, I can't take it as far as as other people who need to be taking it further, and I accept the limitations in order to provide people information and kind of be a conduit of those spaces, in communication. But I feel like it's hard. I don't think you can without an anti-capitalist and abolitionist perspective. Because you're going to, you don't have in your mind what's wrong with it. And you don't have in your mind where you're not looking for the places to dismantle. So you're just kind of participating. So like, I think that, because I have a lens, I can give that information to people. But it takes a lot of people who have different jobs and who have different perspectives and who do different things to do it together. Because it can't be the lawyer or the social worker by themselves. Because they're still, in my opinion, they're still limited and they're still a part of it. And so I believe in community. I believe abolitionism is community. I believe we're envisioning a new world together and we're working together to get rid of these things. But like I said before, like that requires a lot of political and popular education about abolition, about systems, and not leaving these jobs of people who avoid that conversation and who don't discuss those things, who don't engage with policy conversations. That needs to be happening while you're doing the work and problem solving. And, even lawyers, we don't always talk about like the role we have in creating law, like and how the responsibility we have of coming together and saying, none of us believe this law is right. And, making our voices heard, even if we don't break it, because we can't, saying that it's not right. You don't think it works. You don't think it's just justifiable. Those things are important to me. If we're gonna really work, as you say, like within these systems, to have an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-ableist solutions.
This is Lydia. I really appreciate that context too. Not enough of us talk about it, about what it means to take an abolitionist approach while having to contend with the systems that exist as they are now. And I talk about that a lot as doing our work for the long haul while also engaging in strategic non-reformist reform advocacy and harm reduction in the present. My last question, which we have just a few minutes left for, is for both of you on a little bit more of a personal level. How do you work in, around, or with oppressive spaces and institutions as multiply marginalized people yourselves while caring for yourself? What offers you support, care, and rest while doing this work?
Therapy. This is Mahlet. Weekly therapy and sometimes more. Having really good comrades. I'm part of the Boston Liberation Health group, and it's a great group of people to remind myself like there's a lot of us fighting back and not feeling alone. And my siblings, they bring joy. Also working in a place where I have a lot of flexibility. So as someone who has multiple disabilities, like I work per diem, so that works with my ADHD, just my like spoons, and being able to do multiple different things at once, so I don't get bored. And I'm intellectually stimulated at the same time. It doesn't feel like monotonous. Working with my students, they're the highlight of the work. And the last but most important next to therapy is limiting the amount of interaction I have with white women. I'm finally at a job where I only have to interact with 3 white women, and it's very rare. And they're pretty rad, and that has significantly helped my mental health. And I will never go back, ever, ever, ever go back to interacting with more than 3 per week.
This is Lydia. May we all be able to offer each other the support necessary to set those boundaries for ourselves.
Yes.
We need help with it. We all need help with doing that. Jilisa, any final word?
Yeah, this is Jilisa, and that just really resonated with me in a way that I'm expecting. But like I feel so. Yes, therapy. I actually have it twice a week. I wish I could have it every few days, really. But and not twice a week. I'm sorry, bi-weekly. And I feel that I really struggle with creating boundaries, right? I still am working through the ways that having anxiety affect me. That kind of like insight into that is very, so when I'm in a workspace and I'm in a space where I have to do work, people look at me as a very high functioning, quote unquote, as they use that term, person, and that could be because I'm Black woman, that could be for any, just because it's invisible to them. But and how I'm expected to be a machine, right? And when I first started working, I realized that there were no boundaries. It was, the legal system, a legal profession is very just get with as much as you can done as possible. You might have supervisors who have in their mind an idea what's reasonable. And, you might expect it, your worth is how much more you can do to look more helpful. And, and it can be a little bit psychologically damaging for me, and the trauma.
Just a little.
Yeah, the trauma presents in this way where it's am I not good enough? And it's hard because it's having a disability that presents with something small freaking me out, and not being and having overwhelming things, having something overwhelming to do is even more anxiety provoking. And I'm in a place right now where I think sometimes, it's a very push things out, and there's not a lot of space for contemplation. And so, I think I feel safe when I'm hey, can I get some more information about this, how to do this? Because, and so, especially during a pandemic where I'm disarmed. So I've just used therapy to try to get a sense of reasonableness within the context of all the moving parts. And also just to kind of process my needs. I do need a different space, probably ultimately, where I don't have to have those expectations. I can talk about how I learn, how I think. I can say, okay, this is what I don't need this today. The Chauvin case is happening. Can I just talk to you later? I'm searching for that kind of space where I can do those things in the future because it's necessary for my mental health. But I do things like exercise, and I do things like spend time with my friends. It is hard during the pandemic, but I watch things on TV that don't make me think about it, something completely different and funny or interesting that I don't have to think about work and and because I want to be there for my clients, and yeah, the solidarity is what really helps is to know oh, this is just a thing people do to other people and it's not me. It's not something I'm not inferior, and it may be there's certain times where it's not really necessary to be that way. I feel for some reason when the pandemic happened, the people who were capitalists became ultra capitalists. It was now we gotta prove that we can do it even though this is happening. And I'm what? And so watching how people reveal those things about themselves to know oh, that's not a safe space, that's not a safe space, was very helpful to me because I can now think about what questions to ask and what things to look for. It is hard to recover quickly. But it's a daily thing. I try everything I can possibly do to work through it. And knowing that it's systemic is one of the things that helps me feel more grounded. Yeah.
This is Lydia. I've been having these conversations for months, right? About how as soon as things went online, everybody was expected to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard and as long just to prove that we were still productive under racialized capitalism. And how that's not just violently capitalist and racist, but also violently and profoundly ableist. My friend and colleague, Mimi Cook, who was a guest on one of our earlier Liberating Webinars programs, has a quote that she said in a talk she gave 2 years ago. She says, "We live and work in a machine that requires us to be well, that does not allow us to be unwell, that punishes us for being unwell, and that asks us to punish others for being unwell in order to prove that we are well. And that quote, unfortunately, rings true in virtually any space I'm in, no matter what that space is. In our advocacy, in our organizing, in the legal profession or the social work profession, and frankly, really profoundly and horrifyingly, but not surprisingly at all, in activist and organizing spaces too. We are expected not to exist as people, but as Jilisa, you said, as machines. We're expected to be resources instead of humans. That burden has always fallen more heavily on those of us at the margins of the margins. My hope is that with our conversations, our work, and our labor, we will keep building better alternatives to those ways of doing labor, of doing work. And that when we talk about our education system and when we talk about supporting youth who are facing oppression and supporting ourselves in doing that work when we are not youth ourselves, that we will be having much more of this focus on liberation as requiring care and liberation as requiring creating the infrastructure and networks and communities necessary to sustain care. So with that, our time for this conversation has concluded, and I would like to invite our audience members, our participants, to stick around for a chance for live Q&A with our guests. Thank you so much, Jilisa and Mahlet. It has been a pleasure and an honor to know you and work with you both.
You as well.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us today. This is Lydia. And we have Mahlet and Jilisa here with us now. If you have questions, please feel free to share them in the chat. We have time for a few. The person who asked about the quote is from Mimi Cook. I put it in a chat, spelled K-H-U-C. We have one question from Yingya, Y-N-G-Y-A, Vang, V-A-N-G, who asked, where can I get resources and network for neurodivergent children of color in the Twin Cities in Minnesota? That's definitely a very specific question. I know that one of AWN's board members, Jessica Horvath Williams, H-O-R-V-A-T-H, is located in the Twin Cities, and Jessica Horvath Williams may be a person who might be connected better to that area and may know who the right organizations and groups are to reach out to. Chelsea Silvers has a question for Mahlet. How do you handle ABA approaches in schools being used by teachers? Or have you experienced this and found it harmful?
Yes. So there was a school that I worked at prior where they had an ABA therapist come into the classroom. And when I would do classroom observations, it was collaborating in a way where it's like, why do you think like that? Like, why do you assume this behavior needs to be corrected or X, Y, and Z, and kind of have them question their practice. Also working with parents and educating them on what ABA is and the history of ABA. I currently have a client who has a behavioral therapist, and it's a lot of, again, collaboration, because I can't say, like, I don't think you should work with this person. That's really counterproductive. And in those situations, it's really harm reduction, and really uplifting what the student or child is saying. And since in therapy we're, delving deeper on their feelings, and it's less behavior oriented, I can inform what the behavioral therapist is doing so that it's not as bad as it could be. And I know that's not, the best situation, but unfortunately that's what happens in the field. I think in particular, in this case, the parent requested an ABA therapist, and in this situation, it would not be beneficial to push back on what the parent wants, and that would ruin the rapport that I have. But thank you for asking that question. It's a good one.
This is Lydia. Most people in our community, and I think you know this already from our conversations and work, Mahlet, are very adamantly opposed to the use of ABA in any form because it is so inherently traumatizing and abusive. And I know just how demoralizing it can be to be stuck, at least sometimes, working within systems where you can even say, this is wrong and you need to stop it, but you know that you can't actually stop the person from doing it. And that's why we talked about this during our discussion. Sometimes work that we do has to be outside of those structures and institutions altogether. Erica Burrows asks, I believe this question can be for both of you. Thank you so much for the insight and framing you three provided around these issues. I'm extremely curious if you could design a school environment to support us all. What would be key tenets?
I actually have a notebook where I write down a bunch of ideas for like a dream school and like what the mission would look like. And I'm actually going to pull it up because I haven't looked at it in a while and see what I have written. Oh, one of them is like no tests, or which would be ideal, or like making sure that assessments are actually reflected on what is taught and not like this punitive thing where it's like, I'm going to make this as hard as possible. And where students have multiple ways of showing what they've learned. Definitely doing the social emotional stuff. Jilisa, feel free to hop in here.
Yeah, I was definitely about to say no standardized tests, like you don't have all these assessments where you compare kids to each other. I would like to have spaces where kids can like communicate whatever way they want to as well, and like, because I think that's important. We're always kind of forcing that, like how they should be able to explain what they learning and everything like that. And communication, I think, is one of the biggest things I see like kids struggle with, especially culturally speaking, being able to communicate their feelings, especially. And I think, I mean, honestly, in my ideal world, all learning will be individualized. I know that's like, right now, it's like an impossible practicality to be in people's minds, but yeah, I think there shouldn't be this standard for how to learn and how to teach.
Also
and I hate the classroom. I know I mentioned that earlier. I hate the classroom setup, like where everybody's like, I really hate that. So maybe like different ways that you can move. I feel like kids should be able to like lay down on bean bags, but they can learn better that way. Like it shouldn't have to sit like that. So
This is Mahlet. It's funny how richer school districts will have things like that. And places like BPS may not have those accommodations unless the teacher buys it themselves and believes that it's necessary, which is really unfortunate.
This is Lydia. I also have always thought about my dream education system as being one in which students at all ages, even very young ones, have the ability to have ownership and agency in their education, and in which everyone's education matches what their specific strengths and capacities and struggles and difficulties are, and fluctuates and adjusts and adapts as children change, and recognizes even that the pace of learning needs to be different at different points and for different subjects, faster or slower. And I would love to see a system like that, and also one that explicitly embraces and affirms students' gender and race and culture and faith and disabilities. We just don't have that. Our next question is from Kavar, C-A-V-A-R, who asks, I'm wondering if anyone could speak to the relationship between your efforts and broader mad pride or anti-psychiatry movements, especially in relation to abolitionist approaches to therapy, education, or social work. Put another way, how do the non-reformist reforms we're discussing relate to abolitionist efforts? What are the collaborative possibilities? Big questions, sorry, and thanks again.
I think last time earlier we had this question about being somebody, well, I think it was me talking about being an attorney and kind of like existing in these spaces. And I just want to reiterate that that system of working is not effective in the way that we need it to be. I think, again, like being a legal person, I feel like it's my duty to kind of like, even though I have to, in that moment, understand the law is real, it's kind of like, think about like that information that I get from clients and other people and how, when they're working to abolish different things and explain, some of the stuff we're explaining right now, how I can be somebody to like give them that information too. I think sometimes the legal profession is like an ownership of like their, what they say, their intellectual understanding of the law and all these things. But and it's kind of like wedded to capitalism, how we use it and how we communicate about it. And I think like I'm a big fan of like legal education, just not because it's like people should follow it and like make sure that they know what's happening, because they should know. I think that directly impacted people have the ability to say that part right there, no, and like remove the things that they can see that, aren't working. So I think that that's the way that it connects. On an everyday basis for me, it doesn't. I'm still, as a social worker too, trying to unpack some of the things we're talking about, now, about like how the things I'm being taught as a practitioner, like a clinical practitioner, like how many of those things are not effective. So it's a journey of like, dismantling this stuff. So, and I think that in that example, what we just said, like somebody who had to experience that, saying like, this has been normalized and even like been given like a title of credibility, but it's not working for me. So that has to continue to happen and connect with what's happening already in order for people to kind of like dismantle it.
That's a really great question, Kavar. So as someone who's been involuntarily hospitalized several times, I feel like sharing my story and how inpatient psychiatry can be quite traumatic and awful, and ensuring as a clinician that one, if hospitalization is needed, that they do not go to the hospitals that I've been to or know that are specifically awful. And again, sharing that narrative and showing that clinicians are human too, and using our own personal experiences in how we practice. So that's more on the personal side. The Boston Liberation Health Group is doing a lot of work about not calling the police, especially for mental health crises. I will never call the police on a client. There has been a situation where another clinician has called the police on a client, and literally the worst case scenario, it was it was last year. And this client was Black, and having to circumvent all that, like calling several police departments. Again, it's the harm reduction piece. We have something like calling different police departments and being like, please don't, like, if you're gonna find this person, like, these are the things that you need to take into consideration. Because at that point it was out of my hands and they already had like a search out for this person. We have something called the BEST team in Boston, where you can call and they do psychiatric evaluations, but there is no guarantee that the police will also be called. So doing the best that we can to ensure that if the BEST team is called, explicitly saying, do not bring the police. Does that guarantee anything? No, but it's something. Like I said, the Boston Liberation Health Group is doing some movement work about making sure the police aren't called and creating like tangible things that people can do if there's a situation where they think they need to call the police, and saying like, this is what you should do. Other than that, like, don't. And then
Mahlet, this is Lydia. Our interpreter actually needs to leave now.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we won't be able to take additional questions without interpretation support. We have received some excellent questions through the chat. And Jilisa and Mahlet, if you're open to it, I would love to share those questions with you if you would be interested in responding to them. And I would like us to find another way to share that back so that the folks who ask those questions can maybe get a few responses. If you're both open to that.
Yes, yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you again so much to all of you for joining us today. We are so glad for your attendance at these Liberating Webinars programs. Our next program will be on Wednesday in the afternoon on Eastern Time. It takes place at, it's on our website. This is Lydia. It's in the afternoon on Wednesday. If you look at the webinars page of AWN's website, you can see the registration details. Its title is Health Justice is Disability Justice on Disabled Perspectives in Public Health, Research, Policy, and Advocacy. And we hope that you will consider joining us then. When you've submitted questions, I will be sharing those with Mahlet and Jilisa, and we'll find a way to get back some answers via AWN's channels. Thank you all so much. And thank you to our captioner, Cindy, and interpreter, Rachel.